Hello, everybody. I'm Pastor Jason. I'm sure you know that. I'm one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, and coming to you once again with your life group application questions for the week. Real quickly, though, before we jump into that, I've got an announcement. We are going to take a month off of the life group videos. So the entire month of June, I will not produce a life group video. And this is something that historically we have done. We've typically taken some time off from life groups in the summer, and you guys that have been around for a few years, I'm sure, remember that. But for the past couple of years, we haven't, but we believe that it's kind of time to do that again, take a little break from that. So I know many of you life group leaders out there kind of have some stuff planned, some barbecue type stuff. You know, it's a good opportunity if you want to go out and have some fun playing putt-putt, see a movie, something like that. A good time to do that. Either way, regardless of what you do or don't do with these upcoming 4 weeks, there won't be a lesson, a video produced. So take a break. And I know that's probably kind of a relief, a welcome announcement for most of you, many of you. But there might be some of you out there that sort of struggle with that. I know there are a good number of people anyway that really it depends to some extent on getting together every week with one another. And I would just encourage you to take this opportunity to really work on feeding yourself in that capacity. You know, have your outline from the week's message with you. Be praying about some questions that God would bring to mind as a result of what we're learning, and put that into practice for yourself for these next few weeks. And of course, if you run into any sort of struggles, you can always reach out to your life group leader or to me or one of the other pastors. You guys know how to do that. And that's that announcement then. So we will be back on July 5th. July 5th, Tuesday, July 5th is when we will have our next life group video after this one. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the lesson at this point then. You guys know that we're still in our Kingdom series, week 152 of our Kingdom series, that kingdom being comprised of saved believers, at least here on earth, and we're looking at that. And we are at Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. And I'm sure you guys remember that Pastor Lynn had titled this message, What to Do with Annoying People, which on one level brings a smile to our face, but something that is very, very serious and necessary for us to consider. Because the truth is, you know, how often do we run into people problems? Just wishing that people would do the right thing, being bothered by them. And what do we do with that? What do we do in our hearts with that? And, you know, what do we do physically with our bodies with that? So, again, Matthew 18, 10 to 14. I'm going to read those verses out loud right now. You guys, I know, have your copies of God's Word open in front of you, and you're going to be following along. I bet you've got your outline from the weekend message, from Sunday's message in front of you. And we're gonna dig into this now. So here we go. Follow along. Oh, up front though, remember that we want to keep this in context with the verses that we studied last week. And last week, remember, the disciples were fighting about who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus pulled a small child to him, called one over to him as kind of an object lesson for us in humility and what really constitutes being the greatest in the kingdom. And that, of course, is consistent humility, constantly humbling oneself with a childlike dependence on Christ. And he's using that same example as he continues forward in these verses today. So, here we go. Matthew 18, 10 to 14. See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who's in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who's in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. Okay. So, very, very clear that we need to be concerned with despising these little ones. So to kick things off for question one, really get the consideration, the prayer, the conversation going, what do you think that it looks like to despise. Think about that word, what it means to you, and then talk about what you think it looks like to despise others. And then do you think that that's common for you? Is that something you struggle with? And then maybe talk about why you answer the way you did. Go ahead and pray about that and do that now. Okay, so we know that despise is a very, very strong word, but it's despising makes it clear that you believe that somebody else deserves some level of condemnation. And to despise someone can look like a major rage, or more commonly can be something that we just say, oh, that person's annoying, they're frustrating. And what does it look like? Well, to think meanly of somebody on any level, maybe poking fun at their struggles, condescending in regard to their struggles, looking on another person with contempt or disdain, and then of course behaving scornfully, as if we don't care what happens to that person. So this is what it looks like to despise people. And we see in our verses that we're being very, very, very clearly instructed not to despise these little ones. And then he talks about the sheep that wanders away from the fold. And of course, he is speaking specifically about less mature believers, people that are in a position that where they're not as grown. They might be closer to stumbling. They might have some serious struggles in their life that are going to make them more frail, more fragile. But we want to keep in mind that we know that Jesus' will is that none should perish, right? So we don't use grace as a license to sin in this respect and say, well, Jesus is talking about saved people, so then we don't need to worry about whether or not we're despising non-believers. No, the conversations we have with non-believers are certainly different than the conversations that we have with believers, but at the same point, we don't despise. We want to make sure that our example is one that glorifies Christ, regardless of whether or not somebody is saved or unsaved. And in that regard, we want to know that Jesus' will is that none should perish. Now, we know that some people will remain lost, but his will is that they wouldn't be. And that means that our example always needs to be one of their best interest and not our despising or scorn. So, moving on to question 2. Again, Jesus makes it very clear that we are to avoid despising. Why specifically is that such a big deal? What are the implications when we despise others? And then what are the consequences when we despise others? So we see very clearly from our key verses that it's a big, big deal. Why? What are the implications? What are the consequences? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, so again, as I mentioned before, and as Pastor Lynn mentioned on Sunday, if you're despising on any level, thinking meanly, standing in contempt, you're believing that that person deserves condemnation. And that is certainly putting yourself in the place of God. So to despise is to put yourself in the place of God. It is absolutely sin to do that. In despising, you wander away from Christ. And in wandering away from Christ, that means that you're wandering away from God. And of course, in despising, you are certainly a stumbling block for other people, aren't you? So that's why it's such a big deal. And the consequences, of course, there are eternal consequences to that. So we need to bear that in mind in our dealings with other people, both physically and in our heart. Okay, so moving on. Question 3. So keeping all of this in mind, let's be honest about this. Who are you despising, and how are you justifying it? And believe me, this is extremely common. People legitimately hurt one another, right? I'm sure that you've been legitimately hurt. When I ask the question, who are you despising? Probably somebody comes to mind straight away, and right on the heels of that, you've got reasons, and very good reasons, that you would think they deserve to be despised. And yet, we are very clearly instructed to keep guard on that, to watch that, to refrain from despising, because our heart should be that people find the Lord, right? So, again, who are you despising, and how are you justifying it? And one other thing, let's be careful with this, right? Maybe there's somebody sitting next to you right now that you're frustrated with, and this is your great opportunity to tell them why you despise them. Well, no. Make sure that your heart is in line with the heart of Christ and that your motivation is proper in this. And this is about your heart and not somebody else's. So who are you despising? How are you justifying it? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, and hopefully we're getting a hold of the fact or being reminded of what Pastor Lynn talked about on Sunday when he said that thinking little of others means that you're thinking much of yourself. There's quite an arrogance in it, and that is the opposite of humility. And we know that humility equals maturity. So thinking little of others means you're thinking far too much of yourself. That is the opposite of humility, which means it's immature. It's the opposite of maturity. And we know clearly, Philippians 2:3 tells us very, very clearly that we shouldn't do anything from selfish ambition, but we should consider others more significant than ourselves. Right? That should be our heart. The great instruction against despising in that verse. So, bearing that in mind, we'll move on to question 4 here. Thinking about maturity, thinking about humility. The question is this: what level of maturity should people expect to see from you? What should they be seeing from you? Do they see it? Do you care? And why or why not? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay. So hopefully God is revealing some heart issues that we may have so that we can then prayerfully confess and repent, right? And I ask, do you care? Because it's so clear that many people do not, just are not thinking about their example to their children, to fellow church members, to the example to the community at large. And we call ourselves Christians. We're each one of us called to be an ambassador of Christ. So, what we're doing makes a huge difference. Being in fellowship with the body of believers on Sunday is a huge issue. And I mention that one because I struggle with it a lot, and it's one that I see that people just treat so haphazardly or arbitrarily, as though what's coming from the pulpit doesn't really make any difference. It doesn't matter if I'm there to receive that or not, And what does that say? What does that say to your spouse? What does that say to your kids? What does that say to your fellow church members? What does that say to the community at large, that you call yourself a Christian and yet never ever show up to church? And that's just one example of many, but do you even care? Do you see it? Do you care? And what level of maturity should people expect? So, keeping all of this in mind, let's go to question 5, our takeaway question. What is God revealing to you? And remember, one of the things that we were really clearly instructed to do in the message on Sunday was to be more vigilant in bringing the case of those that we despise before God, because that's what we should do, right? Regardless of whether or not we have truly been harmed, our goal should not be that another perishes. Our goal should be, just as Christ is, that all should be saved. And then our heart and our actions should reflect that. So rather than rolling the anger and the frustration and the bitterness and the resentment over and over and over in our hearts and in our minds and justifying it, rationalizing it, talking about it, can't believe that this person did this, I'm so incensed, rather than doing that, we should be pleading that person's case before the Lord. That's what we should do. So how can you be more vigilant in bringing the case of those that you despise before God? And then, are there any other next steps for you that God has revealed as a result of this message? Okay, that's it for this week, guys, and that will be it until July 5th. And if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. Website, www.insidenp.com. You can go download the app. It's just Inside NP, wherever you get your apps from. And Lord willing, I'll be back with another video on July 5th.